Over in New Zealand, I spoke with the headmaster at Auckland Grammar School, Mr. Tim O'Connor. For years, Mr. O'Connor's been critical of the education system, and more recently, he's been a staunch advocate for in-person learning. What is your view on how masks impact socializing on campus and those kinds of interactions? Why do you feel that they're a hindrance?
They're a hindrance because you can't actually see what the people's facial expressions. You're reading a lot from the person who you're interacting with, and very difficult to do when you lose the entire facial, that context to be able to read someone's eyes purely.
All right. Mr. O'Connor, you are the headmaster at the Auckland Grammar School. And the reason I reached out to you initially for this interview, I came across a few articles, actually. One of them was by Stuff, the first one back in May of 2020. And what you referred to back then, a lack of educational strategy in the wake of the COVID pandemic with regards to New Zealand's, I think, response to that. And what's the situation like now? Because that was a while ago, but how is the situation now, and how do you feel about it now?
Well, the situation is that each school's really being left to their own devices, which from my point of view is fine. We have a system in New Zealand where we have local governance. So ultimately the responsibility lies with each board of trustee, headmaster or principal. However, I also think that we should have a coordinated approach across the country in terms of what is best practice for teaching in an online environment, and that would then allow schools to make decisions as to what pieces of that research would be applicable to their context.
Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit, like you said, left to their own devices a bit. And as I understand, at the Auckland Grammar School, you guys are doing all in person right now, right?
Yeah, we're in a very fortunate position to be on campus learning and have been. So our first term of the school year was a 12-week term, and we had 8 days of online learning take place across Auckland because of changes of alert levels due to COVID-19. So we've had some online learning, but the majority has been on campus, and we're hopeful that will continue in on-campus vein for some time to come.
In these articles and during all of this, you've definitely been a strong advocate for in-person learning, and you guys are doing that now. Why do you feel that's so important for the students to be there in person versus just doing, Zoom classes?
Sure, because of all of the machinations of what students get from being present. And I'm talking about the relationships that are forged. If you think about learning in its own, if we say one, we've got relationships, we've got context of extracurricular activities, the tone, the culture, those things that are set through being present. Our young men, we're in a single-sex boys' school, our young men told us that they missed being able to just throw a ball around at lunchtime and to have those idle conversations, to play sport, to pull on the rugby jersey or the hockey jersey to represent their school, to mix and mingle with other people that they wouldn't in any other context. If you look solely at learning, then in a learning context, we're very deliberate about how we teach on campus. So 40-minute lessons, 7 lessons a day, see every one of your teachers every day. And again, that is quite deliberate, short and sharp. And you lose a lot of that in an online context where it is left solely to student motivation. And students who are highly motivated in online context can carry on. Students who have devices, the appropriate devices, can carry on. In an on-campus situation, the aspects of learning that get enriched beyond just sheer teaching of content and the sheer acquisition of, of primary knowledge. So It is the conversations that take place that once a student has has primary knowledge, where they can form an opinion and go on to higher level learning. And in an online context, it's really difficult to have. As we just know how we have to conduct meetings in a Zoom context. They're fantastic because they allow us to meet. But the difference between meeting in person and meeting online, there are significant differences because there are just aspects that are lost online.
What skills does your school specifically look to promote in your students? Whether it's something from like practical skills or just like a more I don't know, something more like technical or something. What kind of skills do you guys want to focus on and promote, and how does the in-person environment help to facilitate that?
Sure. We want young men to get the best academic qualification they can. And if we were going to be blunt, then yes, you could do a lot of that in an online context. But that's not all we profess to do in our environment. We want young men to be able to live values of integrity and commitment and respect and humility. Those sorts of values you need to be present for. You need to be having relationships with other people and learning from other people about what is I guess on one hand socially acceptable, and how the application of those values, one can make you a better person and can make you an even more effective contributor to society. In an online context, it's very easy to be focused on self and not to have a context that you are part of something bigger than yourself. By coming into a school environment, and while in New Zealand terms we're an old school, and worldwide terms we're not, we're 152 years old, but our young men just physically coming in to celebrate assembly on a daily basis is an act of humanity which allows young men to actually understand, to learn all sorts of things about themselves and how they can be better people as a consequence.
In another article by NewsHub, you talked about how there's this kind of demand for students to wear face masks, and that's something I don't hear talked about very much. What is your view on how masks impact learning on campus, or socializing on campus, and those kinds of interactions? Why do you feel that they're a hindrance?
They're a hindrance because you can't actually see what the people's facial expressions. You're reading a lot from the person who you're interacting with. And I was watching some news articles the other day, and they made some statements that were ambiguous statements. And I was trying to read whether they were saying those things with humour, or whether there was a degree of arrogance in their statement. And very difficult to do when you lose the entire facial, that context, to be able to read someone's eyes purely. That said, we don't prevent young men from wearing masks. It's their choice as to whether they wear a mask at school, and some young men do, and that's fine. We don't make an open. We don't openly or discourage students or staff members from wearing them. We simply say it's your choice. I think through making that choice open, we've found that very few, after a period of weeks, actually continue wearing them because of all the reasons that we understand can inhibit when you're wearing a mask.
As I understand it, New Zealand has had very few case numbers compared to other countries. You guys have actually mostly had things under control. But at the same time, I think I remember reading another article. You talked about how there's this sort of unreasonable levels of anxiety and fear in the public. How has that been now? Has that calmed down? Do you think that's still a factor? How is that sense of that going right now?
Um, I think human nature, or the way we are as humans, means that we forget pretty quickly, and we've been in a privileged position where there hasn't been a lockdown for some time, and so as a consequence, I think what occurs is people become complacent and they readily return to thinking that everything is normal. I think as a country we've become quite complacent, and it's a dangerous position to be in. While we are continually reminded by ministries of health and education and the government that we all should be being socially responsible, and that's not really that evident across the board. Um, the school context is very different because the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health never applied the same health standards to schools as it did to general public. So social distancing or physical distancing, for example, didn't exist as much in a school context, but when students walked outside the gate, they had to apply different codes. That was very difficult. You try to explain to 13 to 18-year-olds that when you're inside the gate, this is what you're allowed to do. You can throw a ball around, you can be shoulder to shoulder, but when you walk outside, you need to be 2 meters distanced. And that was the context that I was referring to in the media, is that people would become offended that our students were walking shoulder to shoulder home, but they had two sets of rules. They had rules for inside the gates and rules for outside the gates. So you can understand it wasn't actually about wanting to willfully disobey alert levels. It was actually just confusion.
And how well have your students adapted overall? And maybe what challenges have there been, or what you know, how have they been adapting overall? And if you have a sense of that.
Really well, actually. We've been encouraged. Last year, the external examination results were stunning. We operate two pathways: the New Zealand national qualification, which is NCEA, and we offer Cambridge International examinations as a pathway as well. The Cambridge results were the best we've seen in 5 years. NCA results were just above par, where we were what we would expect. And given the length of time that students were learning online, and if you read some of the research, what McKinsey report says, etc., it has happened internationally for students that they saw, a drop of achievement levels. They saw a drop of learning. We've seen the opposite, and I think there are reasons for that. Some of that is about the resiliency of the young people. Some of it is about the structure that we used to teach. But a major factor in it is that we had a lot more time in person on campus than most schools around the world. So we were, again, in a privileged position where our young men were advantaged because of on-campus learning. I think moving forward, what we are seeing from students transitioning between on-campus and online learning is that students are able to cope very quickly. So we have literally twice this in the last 3 months switched to online learning overnight. So without any notice, and students have responded. They have been the most responsive for a short period of time. So we had one 3-day block and one 5-day block of online teaching, and both worked well. My fear would be that if the period of online learning got extended to 3 weeks, 4 weeks, etc., then we would have to be employing a range of other strategies to try and keep students engaged.
Right. Do you find that the more that these policies change, and I guess the more inconsistent things are, Is that where things kind of start to become more difficult? Is when you have to adapt very rapidly, as you're mentioning?
Yes, we have, through all of the processes thus far, when we've moved to online learning and rules or guidelines have changed, health and safety wise, we've scenario planned. So we've ended up with 2 or 3 different options, waited for and predicted what the outcomes would be, and then went, oh, that's option 2 with a few tweaks. We'll apply option 2. So we spent a lot of time on that, generating that material, so that when the changes were implemented, we could actually maximise learning time. If we didn't do that, we could have lost days to then put in place plans that met the guidelines. So yeah, that's been important.
Back a few years ago, I know you had some criticisms of the standardized testing system and of the NCEAs. Um, uh, what is your view of them now?
There are still changes occurring with NCA. NCA level 1, what they are proposing to implement is very weak and very generic subjects. So we're not even going to be teaching the individual. Well, we will be, because we will ignore what NZQA are proposing. But what they are proposing at level 1 is for things like, there will only be a commerce subject, there will not be economics, accounting and business studies, and science. There will be general science taught, not biology, chemistry and physics. We're totally opposed to that, and we believe in the development of foundational knowledge from the student's entry point into school, and layering that year upon year, so that as they enter into their external examinations, they have enough in-depth knowledge to be able to have opinions and develop arguments in their examinations. And we're very fearful of where NZQA, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, is heading. And we're fortunate, I guess, that we have Cambridge examination system in place alongside it. And we implemented our own assessment system and curriculum at the end of our junior schooling, so that we didn't have to enter NCEA level 1. And so we've effectively created a more rigorous year's curriculum and assessment system, so that as students enter their external examinations, they're going to be advantaged, rather than what we think NCA will do, and that will be to disadvantage students.
So with this kind of, aside from remote learning in general, it does seem like globally there is a shift in education in terms of what the focus is on, and the type of material that's taught. In the case of what you're talking about, what is the focus shifting towards, that you're saying the NZQA?
NCEA, yes.
Yeah. What is their focus shifting towards, and why do you feel as though it's not it's not the best fit for education?
Well, NCA, the initial qualification is level 1, so there's 3 levels. Level 1 is the Form 5 or Year 11 qualification. What NZQA and the Ministry of Education in New Zealand are saying is that students should have wider choice, that they shouldn't specialise too early. I don't disagree with that. I agree with that, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't teach them specialist content. Our job is to teach them things that they're not just going to fall across in their daily lives, or that they can Google. Our job is to teach them specialist content so that they can apply it to their everyday lives, and that is going to be missing, I fear. And I think, on one hand, while the context is, let's not let students generalise too quickly, it is also about producing achievement rates that are actually better than they are. And we can see what New Zealand's position is in the world by the OECD statistics that show us that our reading, writing and mathematics results have fallen, while NCEA results over a 5-year period have increased. So the two don't align, they should align. So my belief is we need to ensure that we are teaching basic foundational knowledge that students can launch themselves on, and that is our primary duty.
Mm-hmm. What can parents do during periods of remote learning or in this situation in general with the shift in climate to best help their children? Or what methods have you noticed are the most effective in kind of just the family situation at home for a lot of these kids?
Yeah, I would be encouraging my son or daughter to be doing their work in the dining room or somewhere more public, not their bedroom. By all means, give them moments when they can do that in isolation, but to be doing work where they can ask you as a parent a question. You can give them confidence by just being present and encouraging. One of the things that students will lose, a good average student will lose during this process, is self-motivation, because they're not able to rub shoulders with their mates. They don't have direct access. Well, they may have access to their teacher, but it's an online access. So there's, again, lots that is lost through not being able to have that conversation. So I'd ensure that they were somewhere more public in the household so that you are on hand. It still needs to be a place where it's quiet. I wouldn't allow them to be wearing headphones and the like, to be have distractions from music, etc. And I would be asking the school for access to their learning management system so I could actually see the lessons that my son or daughter was being given, and I could be as involved in that as much or as little as I wanted, but at least I could see that if there was work that needed to be submitted, when it needed to be submitted by, so that I could, one, support the school, but also support my child's learning.
In many schools in the West and well, across the world, really, there's been a big reliance on tech. How do you view the relationship with education and tech? Do you have any concerns about that, or do you think these tools are can be used for good? Kind of, where do you see that relationship with tech and education?
Yeah. I think a school has to make a decision as to what style of teaching is going to be conducted. There is so much out there that you could be wooed by IT, and it all, some of it looks, some of it is very seductive. And I continue to go back to what is the primary task that we have at hand? What are we trying to achieve? And what tools do we need to actually reach those goals? And if I used us as an example, we've made it clear to our team. So we operate an online learning management system, a platform where students can access each one of their lessons. They can communicate with their teachers via chat rooms, Zoom, etc. They can ask questions and have them answered from the class, etc. But what we've said to our teachers is that we would rather see you doing small screencasts of between 5 and 10 minutes of teaching moments than for you to Zoom an entire 40-minute lesson. And the reason for that is because we know in an online context that if everything is live, that a student can't go back and revisit it. They don't have access to the teacher in the classroom to immediately say, oh, sorry, sir, miss, I don't understand that aspect. Whereas if we screencast the teachable moments, then students can go back and rewind to the pieces that they didn't understand and play it again until they actually understand what it is the teacher was expecting. That's just one example of the use of IT, what we say we would like to use and what we prefer teachers not to do. And so if a school hasn't set its own framework and structure for how it wants its teachers to teach, then I think that's a pitfall, and would be one of the very first things I would be encouraging any school to do, is to decide the style of education that they're going to teach in an online context and ensure that lines up with how you teach on campus. and to articulate that framework to your teaching staff and to your community.
What got you into the whole field of education? I know that's an open-ended question, but where does your sort of passion for all this come from, or how did you kind of fall into this?
Well, I did sort of fall into teaching, really, and I loved people interaction, so I knew um, that that teaching was something where you are just fully engaged with other people, and it was really through, I guess, experiential learning, becoming a teacher and understanding that the way we communicate can actually have an impact. I can have the content knowledge as a teacher, but can I impart it? And so I became intrigued with that aspect of, if I communicate in different manners, can I reach different target audiences? And you apply that not only to those who you teach, but to your colleagues. And so I moved into management really because my head of department, the English department I was in early in my career, told me I had to go and run my own department because I was starting to run his, which I was actually not mindful of. And since I've been in some form of management position, whether it was a head of department through to being a head of a school, I think it's a real privilege to be able to impact on learning and to develop relationships that become lifelong relationships with not only students but with their parents when you act in their best interests and you act in a genuine manner.
Right. How do you view education more broadly in the future? Where do you think it's going? Where would you like to see it go? Um,
Mm.
uh, what challenges do you see on the road ahead?
I think there will be a blend of online and on-campus teaching, and as our population grows, certainly in a New Zealand context, being able to continue to build new schools will just create greater complexities. So I think we want to be able to use the network of schools that we have quite wisely, and to use an online framework for some of the way we teach. For example, I think moving forward, and it's in my thinking as to what we do here, is when we have parent-teacher interviews, and typically we would send students home for a few hours so that we could start the interview process, or when we need to run full staff-wide professional development days, they're all lost learning opportunities. And why would we not now actually say to students, you've got an online learning day rather than an on-campus learning day? And that we could actually, alongside opportunities like that, we could also actually have days where senior students do not necessarily need to be on campus for learning, and to work in a more university manner, where you say to a cohort that Thursday is your day where you learn online. I would be interested in research through time as to see whether that has any impact on learning. My suspicion is it won't. In fact, it could be more impactful because it is a small drop to online learning, off for a day to learn to complete your work online. You're back at school the following day. You're able to follow up with your teacher. And if that was 1 out of 5 days in a week, or 1 out of 10 once a fortnight, I suspect it would not be harmful, and in fact could have a positive influence. So those are just a couple of examples of where I think we could head. The tools for online learning are going to increase. They're going to become much more user-friendly. And as we do that, then you'll find that the teaching population will embrace a range of online teaching pedagogies that will make it more effective for students. The biggest weakness in online learning is, of course, upskilling our teachers so that we have all of our teachers with the skill sets to be able to use information technology systems, because primarily that hasn't been their job. So we've actually asked teachers to move in a different direction very, very quickly indeed, and to be experts in an area that they're not, or a lot are not.
Right. And I think there is a parallel there with students where it seems like there is more expected of them, and certainly more ways that they have to engage with the material and the school.
Yeah.
What do you?
I
Oh,
students are, lots of people say our young people are digital natives, that they just naturally pick up devices, and I see that with my own children. If I want to work out how to do something on my iPhone, I give it to my children and they fix it for me. But that doesn't mean that they're digitally advanced in terms of what are the tools that they should use to maximize their learning. Like, they know about Google and they know to chuck something into Google, but do they know how to sharpen things up so that their search framework is actually directed to the area that they need to be finding specific information? Do they understand what the best way to learn is online? Because their default position is, I'll put 2 earbuds in and I like listening to my music, and I'll have Netflix on my phone while I've got my screen going with my lesson in front of me. Those things, they might have an awareness of the various forms of digital technology out there, but they do not necessarily know what is the best way to learn online.
mm-hmm.
So we have a job to teach them.
What do you think is the primary difference between a student who's motivated and driven to success and one who's not, who's sort of failing and unmotivated? What do you think is the main factor there, at least as it pertains to your job as educators, to making that difference?
Well, the difference typically is for students who struggle with learning, they quickly move into a fixed mindset that I can't do this, I'm dumb, I'll give up. A student who is highly motivated, and these things are not necessarily related to intelligence. A student who is highly motivated typically moves into a growth mindset. They've experienced some form of success and have understood that actually, if I try that, and if I can't get it, I'm not as concerned about failure if I actually ask questions, and then my mindset moves to I don't get this yet. So we have to move more students from having that fixed mindset into having a growth mindset, so that they can experience some success in learning. And it doesn't matter at what level that learning is. It actually is really important that they experience some success, because as we all know, as soon as we feel we are good at something, we will repeat that particular action, or we'll get more involved in that particular area. So that is one of the simplest things that we can do, is to try and move students from a fixed mindset into a growth mindset. And in online learning, it is exactly the same thing, because highly motivated students are prepared to complete the tasks online. They're not too concerned if they experience failure. They're working through the completion of the task online. They'll receive the feedback from the teacher, and they'll go back and continue to attempt it until they get it right. Again, why? Because they know that if they continue to do it, they may experience some success. And then they actually understand what happens when you start to build some knowledge and you just continue to layer it. And the opposite happens for someone who is not a natural learner. And so they just actually dig a bigger hole for themselves, and they will avoid going online. So they know that actually, if I don't switch my computer on, my teacher can't get to me. If I ignore it, it's not there until I actually am held accountable. So what we've done is put systems in place. So we've told boys what our online teaching framework is, and we've explained to them that in each one of their subjects, they will have periods of time where they have to submit work. And the submission of work online is a critical part of their learning, so that the teacher can see that they are attempting work, they can give them feedback, and then there is a checklist process before they return to campus to show that they have attempted all of the work. And if they, excuse me, and if they haven't, then our expectation is not that they're going to be given detentions, but that they are going to remain at school until they have completed that work. So it's an accountability model for students who are demotivated, so that we can give them some form of extrinsic motivation to complete the work because they don't have that themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Have you noticed any cases where in your school where the students who maybe there's one particular student or a group of students who were struggling, and with these a kind of different approach, or maybe they even transferred to your school and they were a struggling student? Like, are there any cases like that where you've noticed a change, a transformation from?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A large number of students who move into that mode, and they're light bulb moments for them. And it is heartening. It's why, if you go back to why do you do what you do, well, those are the moments. The brightest, highly motivated students are wonderful to support, and they're going to succeed, and they're going to go to universities of choice around the world. The students who we gain considerable satisfaction from are those students who you're describing, who haven't experienced success, who come in, work within the framework, and start actually talking about their learning, start talking about their achievement, and having conversations about their marks. Because as soon as you see that, you understand that they have grown their understanding of learning, that they are prepared to have a conversation about it. Whereas typically you'll see boys in the grounds having conversations about sports results or their performing arts practices, etc. We want to change the language to be having conversations about their subjects, because that's then you're seeing growth in young people, and we are certainly seeing that.
Well, it sounds like you guys are on top of things. You guys have a very, it seems like, healthy learning environment. So I'm happy to have your perspective. Thank you for your time, Mr. O'Connor. I think that covers just about everything.
Pleasure to be able to talk to you. Congratulations on the work you're doing. It sounds interesting.